The Bracero program, the exploitation of farm workers that changed two nations. The year is 1942, and World War II is ravaging the globe. But the war isn't just present on the battlefield. Farmers throughout the United States are leaving their fields in pursuit of the higher-paying defense industry. Within a year, a shortage in agricultural workers and food supplies spreads across the country. The government begins to ration staple foods, and individuals are issued ration books for certain foods each month. Still, prices skyrocket, and U.S. labor studies in May of 1942 find that over 1 million rural workers have moved to military and factory jobs. Searching for a diplomatically stable solution, the U.S. turns to Mexico. And soon, discussion and negotiation over the Bracero program begins. Lasting from 1942 to 1964, the Bracero program saw over 4.5 million Mexican men imported to the United States to work in agriculture, performing backbreaking labor while often suffering from abuse and unfulfilled promises by the U.S., despite numerous diplomatic agreements between America and Mexico regarding their fair treatment and well-being. With its justification highly debated throughout history, the program preserved agriculture in the United States while providing jobs to the impoverished in Mexico, but heightened competition for work within the U.S. and created the country's lasting dependency on foreign labor that still exists today. When the U.S. Department of State diplomatically approached Mexico in 1942, proposing the idea of a migrant worker program, Mexico was initially incentivized due to the recent 10-year Mexican Revolution that had left many citizens in poverty, desperately seeking jobs. So on July 23rd, Mexican ambassadors Ernesto Hidalgo and Abraham Navas met with U.S. representatives Joseph McGurk, John Walker, and David Meeker, starting a long series of diplomatic agreements between the U.S. and Mexico for years to come. And after just weeks of negotiation, the first draft of the Bracero program was enacted. Throughout the 22 years of the Bracero program's implementation, many aspects were amended. But despite the countless renegotiations, it remained far from perfect. The word bracero means one who works with their arms, derived from the Spanish root brazo, meaning arm, and suffix ero, meaning one who works. This is a fitting demonstration of how they were viewed as nothing more than replaceable tools.
They could care less about the body or even less about the life. They didn't want that life in the United States, but they wanted those arms. So far as those arms could work, they were welcome, and when they couldn't, they were sent back.
The treatment braceros faced reflected this attitude. For example, braceros were not permitted to operate machinery, often forcing them to resort to stoop labor, where workers harvested crops in a hunched or squatting position for hours. This practice was extremely destructive, and later studies found that 1 in 20 braceros working in agriculture experienced severe long-term back problems. Additionally, braceros often worked 10 to 12 hours a day, while still being cheated out of their already low wages. Originally, the minimum wage was established at 30 cents per hour, but this was often flouted by farmers. And instead of the promised basic sanitary equipment and housing, braceros were usually crammed into tight barracks by the dozen.
Con agua fría, o calentar el agua para bañarte, porque a veces hace un frío en la manzana, hace un frío y barracas ni arregladas están.
Yet despite the unaddressed mistreatment braceros faced, the position was in extremely high demand, with thousands of applicants each year. Hopefuls would often move closer to the US-Mexico border for higher chances of being chosen, and bribing officials was not at all uncommon. But it seemed all this would change on September 2nd, 1945, when Japan formally surrendered, bringing World War II to an end. Droves of farm workers began returning to their old employment, and a serious debate was raised. Should the Bracero program continue? Two sides emerged. Farm workers returning from war found their job positions occupied by Mexican laborers, and many hoped to send the braceros home. However, employers had been enjoying the availability of cheap labor and argued that braceros were still necessary. They pointed to how post-war urban expansion had caused people to become reliant on public services to support their everyday life. Suddenly, businesses needed braceros to supply resources for the sudden influx of customers. The Mexican government was also supportive of the program's extension, as they were hoping that braceros would return with high wages they'd earned in the US, boosting Mexico's economy. The combined pressure for the program's continuance kept building, until it was eventually extended to the end of 1946. Throughout the Bracero program's existence, the number of Mexican entrants increased exponentially. An estimated 44,000 braceros arriving in 1945 evolved to nearly 450,000 in 1956, making it seem that the diplomacy between America and Mexico had been a huge success. But unbeknownst to many, the growing flood of legal Mexican immigrants had incited a torrent of illegal ones as well. It was estimated that in 1949, 4 out of 10 migrant farm workers were illegal immigrants. These workers were gladly hired by employers because they had no rights and could easily be threatened in fear of deportation. To address this, Operation Wetback ensued in 1953. The term wetback referenced how illegal Mexican immigrants often waded across the Rio Grande River to sneak into America. During Operation Wetback, illegal immigrants were rounded up to be sent back to various unfamiliar parts of Mexico. After a single year, it was announced that 1.1 million illegal immigrants had been removed by the operation, making it the largest mass deportation in United States history. But with the Bracero program's set termination date approaching and negative consequences apparent, Congress once again had to decide whether or not to extend it. Until on September 17, 1963, an event happened that revealed what seemed the only justifiable option. At a railroad crossing outside Cholula, California, a freight train crashed into a makeshift bus, immediately killing 28 of 58 total braceros. It was dubbed the worst bus tragedy in US history, and became a rallying cause for upcoming civil rights movements. Initially, only 12 of the total 32 bodies were identified, as workers were traditionally distinguished by numbers rather than names. Another exposed fact was that the US government had been categorizing farm workers as vehicle loads, alongside metal, wood, and hay. The Cholula bus crash quickly became the face of debate for braceros' justice, finally shining light on the long-ignored mistreatment braceros had faced. An audience of 9,000 attended the funeral of the crash's total 32 victims, and national strikes on food produce sent a clear message to Congress. The Bracero program had to end. Again, debate began to emerge, but this time the public outrage was too great. So in May of 1963, Congress announced that the Bracero program would be terminated by the end of the next year. Although braceros did not completely disappear when the program ended, their presence slowly faded, most having returned to Mexico and reunited with their families. For some time, Mexico struggled with the surplus of agricultural workers, as there was simply not enough demand for the thousands of natives flooding back into the country. Meanwhile, the US was struggling as well. The country's dependence on braceros was not fading easily, as America had developed a reliance on foreign labor that would prove difficult to eradicate. Mexican workers had been willing to perform labor that domestic workers refused to. Without them, many tedious tasks remained incomplete. Even as of 2022, programs like the H-2A exist to satisfy this dependency. These are constantly being reformed by debate and past mistakes, striving to treat workers as humans rather than arms.
They weren't just a problem to be solved or eliminated. They were men who had wives, who had girlfriends, who had children.
When errors from the past can be recognized and addressed, when desperate people seeking a second chance can be accepted and valued, then together the world can build a place where no one needs to suffer for opportunity.